I'm excited to meet with Felipe Ribeiro, a visual artist, independent curator, chair and associate professor of the Dance Studies M.A. program at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. He holds a master's degree in cinema studies at NYU and a PhD in visual arts at Rio de Janeiro State University, partially completed at NYU's Performance Studies department. His background in experimental filmmaking led him towards his current research, revolving actions, which intertwines durational performance and land art. His performances have been shown in major festivals in South America, as well as in Hamburg, Zurich, and Lisbon. In 2018, he had his first solo exhibition in Rio de Janeiro. In 2022, Felipe and Sarah Berger partnered in Not Here, an exhibition held at Zurich Cabaret Voltaire. His collaborations include many international artists such as Simone Ottoloni, Eleonora Fabian, Marcella Levi, and Lucia Russo. Felipe is also one of the founders and artistic directors of Atos de Fala, an international festival dedicated to speech arts and performance in Rio de Janeiro. Felipe has been a visiting scholar at the Theatre and Performance Department at Roehampton University in 2020 and has lectured internationally. His recent publication, Ruminações, a arte de performance entre o prazer e a resistência, which in English translates into Ruminations, Performance Art in Between Pleasure and Resistance from 2022, is available in Portuguese in Brazil and will be launched in Portugal in 2024. Felipe, thank you so much for making time for our conversation. And here are my two questions. Can performance be conserved? If so, how? And if not, why not? And what does it mean to conserve performance?
Thank you for the introduction and for the questions, Hanna. It's a pleasure to be here thinking about these two questions that you pose for us. And there's something that I find also always very interesting when we're talking about performance art and performance studies. That is, whenever we are asked a question, there is a movement of subverting it and reflecting on the very basis on which it has been asked. So I guess there is a twist that we should start making, like a kind of a performative turn that ought to be enacted, which is to answer if performance can be conserved, is to ask what is conservation, or what conservation becomes through the scopes and the practices of performance. And to start this conversation on conservation, I still find it very interesting to draw back and recuperate performance's understanding by Peg Phelan, because she carries out this idea of the ontology of performance as being an ontology of disappearance. And I like to bring Peggy here, not because in having the ontology of disappearance as the ontology of performance doesn't mean that like performance cannot be archived, but I guess it just inquires how is it that we can archive live art, and how can live art be archived? And my first thought of it would be that if we're talking about live art, archive must be alive as well. So there is something in this living archive that we must reckon with, because when we talk about art being archived, we are talking about art, we are talking about life itself, we are talking about life as a strengthening power of art. We're talking of art as life in the regime of the sensible. So what is it that we are talking when we talk about live arts? Because of course we know that in the performance there is this this friction in between these two instances of art and life. And many times this leads us to thinking that they are two separate things. But if we think that art is life in its full potency, and what life does to art is also to engage it in another potency, if we're talking about bringing this into conservation, what we have to conserve is exactly this. Is this ability of keeping art and life as in the power of potentializing each other. I guess that's what Peggy Phelan is talking when she talks about this ontology of disappearance, and at least like the way I read it, the way I find it interesting to my theoretical and artistic work, and in the frame of your question too, because it's not a matter of simply consecrating vitality in this like pure happening and immediacy. I guess if you're thinking through the scope of performance, we know that vitality as an experience is always both mediated and immediate. So there is like these two instances that builds what vitality and experience is. And what happens is that we are constantly dealing with the notion of an act being repeated and still carrying out some spontaneity. So it's in between repetition and spontaneity that we have to locate, archive. And then comes your question, how do we do it? And I guess like if we were to put this very simply, I would say that dealing with both instances and bringing conservation into it, we can think that conservation is necessarily conservation and loss. There is always loss imbued in conservation. Our task then is to find, like, in each case, a balance of how to keep conservation and also loss. And I like to think conservation as being conservation and loss, because it's so usual that we think that conservation is conservation, that we have like to prevent it from loss, but loss is imbued in it. And what we have to do is to see how we manage so loss doesn't take up all the conservation away. But it's like, how do we balance like both instances that are already part of conservation? My suggestion then would be that to enact conservation as conservation and loss would be that in each situation we have to find a technology that weights loss and conservation in an adequate manner for that performance specifically. And I thought of like two examples that I'll draw on like very, very soon. I just want to, before that, like go back to Peg Phelan, because I find that she helps us to navigate through your question in the way that like she proposes a way to defy delusional and metaphorical values of an archive. Put simply, the way that I relate to her ideas is that like an archive is affirmed as such, the more it's perceived as afterlives, the more it's perceived as that which comes later, that which comes after. And is still coming after perpetuates the performance. So in a way, what we are talking about is how do we open access, but it still like contradicts this access with loss, with the perception of its own limitation, and with opacity. So this is where like I find Phelan's like powerful in your question. But of course, like it does not come as a final answer, in the sense that there is a risk I sense in dealing with performance in this way, like with performance and archive in this way, which is the risk of creating into the performance, of putting the performance in this like melancholic loop of intangibility, which is performance then is always past. It's like it's very seldomly present. It's always something that we refer to, but we have little access to. So it's like, how do we deal, if we're talking about sustaining the vitality of performance, how do we have an archive that understands itself as an afterlife, but is still like does not circumscribe performance in this melancholic and nostalgic access, which in a way takes us out of this potency of vitality that we want to preserve. So I guess my guess when thinking, stimulated by your question, is that the way we have to do this is to think that conservation is also unfolding. So it's not simply to conserve what has been passed, but to make sure that whatever has passed keep unfolding. So there is a sort of like continuity that is confronted with like opacity, in the sense that like it's something that has happened, that like submerged and emerged back and invites us through, like in the middle of the happening, look back and recognize like a history of like of transmission. So I guess when we do this, when we understand conservation as unfolding, what we do is we try to make sure that the past keeps alive, and we do so in this process of like bringing conservation as a means to paradoxically nurture difference. So I guess conservation is able to happen if we understand conservation through the scopes of difference, of never like replacing, but bringing again with a difference. What it does then, when we think of a difference, is that like it sets the event and the performance into a sort of continuity that invites us to think of how can one circumscribe what is an act, what is a performance, what is an event. Can the resonances of an event be considered its own return? Can be considered part of it, like the extension of it? How can resonance be considered performance's own actualization? A way to make an event emerge back to surface. To think of it, I just thought of an amazing case study of a performance that I watched here in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, where I'm currently based. It's a site-specific performance that happens in one of like the most politically vulnerable complex of favelas in Rio, called Favela da Maré. Sorry. And the performance is called Noite das Estrelas, Night of the Stars. What it does, it's like it recovers lives and experiences of being a trans person in that favela in the context of 1980s and 1990s. So Noite das Estrelas was originally a show that happened like with some constancy in that favela, performed by trans people very active at that time. And now it returns as an itinerant performance in that same place, with the new generation drawing back their collective trans genealogy within that area. So I find it very interesting because like this idea of the new trans generation recuperating what has happened in that favela a few decades ago at the time, like in a very small place, very hidden, and now like it returns as a parade throughout the favelas. It's to me like very powerful in the sense of honoring and bringing continuity within that trans genealogy that formed trans lives in that favela. I find this like an interesting example because like thankfully trans movement has been able to address forward their agenda of living consistently their desiring drives. In a way, that's the perpetuation and the archive of performance of like for the trans people or for the queers, which is the ability of sustaining themselves throughout the ages by sustaining like the ability of living through their desiring drives. So as a society, we are very far from a stable and harmonizing relation to trans bodies. And among like the countries who have actually some statistic for it, Brazil like tops the statistics against trans people. So I find like this and special information in the sense of like thinking of their ability to parade and make this performance happen like every Sunday for like 4 months in a very vulnerable place as Favela da Maré. So what we see is that this new trans generation is performing their queer ballroom scenes on the streets, which brings like a suspension of quotidian experiences in that area, which is usually marked by like heavily armed police interventions. And also like, you know, we know the streets are like a major dispute in between like reactionary forces, like religious morals, and the queer bodies that live there in their everyday lives. So it's like there is a sense of like of dispute with queer sexualities that I find it very interesting. And I'm saying this because at some point, the old generation of trans people who also are part of the Noite das Estrelas, because they have been invited to be honored by this new trans generation. This trans woman, she says a sentence that I find like very special for the context of our discussion here. She says, "We cannot restore what hasn't been erased." I find this sentence such a beautiful sentence in terms of how it brings up like the visibility, the sense of continuity, which is you are living now as a consequence of course, your own deeds and desires and persistence, but also through the persistence of the elders, the persistence of who came before and had to pave the way for this parade to be happening now. So the way I understand Noite das Estrelas is that trans history of that happened in that favela, in the context of that favela, is being archived by trans bodies still from that favela. So it's passing on generation by generation, keeping up alive their ability of keeping desire. Because when we talk about queer performances or minority group performances, I guess like what we're talking about is not simply to engage in a struggle of resistance, but understanding that if the reason why we fight is to be able to live our desires, we have to desire while we fight. So desire, the ability to desire does not come after, it comes throughout. So Noite das Estrelas for me sets this continuity of like, I honor the desires and the powers of those who came before me, I bring them here, and I keep this ability of desiring, this desiring ability in my body and in my quotidian life. So if we think through the trans bodies, what we can say is that like performance archives are a laboratorial and elaborated effort of not letting go, of keeping the resonances of an act that perform mostly unfavorable circumstances and that ought to be resonated and vibrated to keep up their energy. So the life, the afterlives of performance then lies in its ever-living performance and not on a representational still life. It's not about capturing an event, making sure we can understand their veridity or can bring like their veridic form into it, but it's actually keeping up the energy and the vitality alive, making sure that in living through it, we bring history with us, the history of that life, of that ability to live with us. And I like to think of this example because what it brings to us, like since we're talking about thinking of what technology entails the ability of conservation and performance, I guess we have here an answer through a technology that is pretty much racialized and sexualized and gendered, I would say, more than sexualized, that is gendered and racialized of like, of how is it that a performance made by Black, mostly Black people, trans persons can be perpetuated. And I like to think of it because it invites us to call for a revision on how does an archive work beyond and besides the modern standards of archived, which is like mostly imposed by the logics of whiteness and patriarchy and private property and collection. Archive here through this gendered and racialized technology, it's something that is shared, transmitted, embodied, commonized, if we can say so. So I guess to go back to the beginning, performance is conserved as long as conservation becomes performance. And in doing so, keep up with the vital energy of becoming without losing the thread of genealogy. I guess this would be my major point in here. Like, how do we understand conservation as performance? And in doing so, we keep like this vitality on, but this vitality is not simply immediate, but it also reckons with what came before. So it keeps the thread of genealogy. Another example came to my mind was something that I came across during was in 2020 during the Black Lives Matter event. And it happened not in the US, but happened in England, in Bristol. In Bristol, protesters had just thrown a statue of a slave owner like into the river. And at the time, the mayor of the city, I think his name was Marvin Reed, he mentioned that he wanted to take the statue out of the river and bring it to the museum, but just as it was. And I find like his idea really interesting. I didn't follow up to know if this happened or not, but I think like that this idea brings for us an interesting cluster of questions. One of them, it's like, what does it do to a museum? What is it worth to musealize? Because in a way, we had heard before of other politicians mentioning that they should like take the statues out of the street and place somewhere else, like in private collections or museums. Or so creating a more protective form of displaying those images, in a way like protecting those like symbols of whiteness of a history, like very much draw by whiteness standards and agency, into a protective place where it would keep it far from the people. What this M.A does, on the other hand, it's to say that museum is not a place to protect. Museum is a place for discussion and a place of accumulation of history. So if we think of a statue as a frozen piece, which in a way synthesizes and freezes history into a figure, what he's suggesting us now is that we take history one step forward, not from the time when it was made, but when it became when it's being enacted. So he's not interested as much in the image, but in the fall. And to retain the fall, to musealize the fall, I find an interesting proposition in terms of acknowledging that history is still on. History has not been, history is not what is past, it's what is continuously happening. And within this, we have our power twists. So archiving here becomes a form of accumulation, of stratification, and it's another possibility that comes to my mind. It's so I guess to conserve then, it's not to freeze it, it's to enable its actions.